Saying I lost my wife 6 years ago, and I don't even want to stay at home. I ain't happy unless I'm singing.
Yeah, well,
You can't sing in your living room. Ain't nobody listen to me but.
They called him the voice of God, a bass so deep it rattled pews and promised redemption. To millions, J.D. Sumner was the sacred spine of Southern gospel, the man who stood behind Elvis Presley, who built the Stamps Quartet into an empire, and who shaped Christian music for generations. But beneath that sanctified baritone, there was a silence. One cultivated, one protected. Artists disappeared, contracts went unsigned, royalties faded into the ether, and those closest to him learned one thing: don't ask questions. Now, decades after his death, the veil lifts. What did J.D. Sumner leave behind? And what was buried with him? His voice could rattle a church pew. J.D. Sumner wasn't just a singer. He was a seismic force in the foundation of Southern gospel. Known for his bone-shaking bass, he set a Guinness World Record for the lowest note ever recorded by a human voice. To the faithful, he was a musical titan, a sacred relic of American spiritual music. To many outside the Southern gospel scene, he was a footnote in Elvis Presley's orbit, a faithful backup singer, a loyal confidant, the man who stood just behind the king and harmonized eternity into his final songs. But to those who knew him best, J.D. Sumner was far more complicated and far more dangerous, because buried beneath the gospel robes and Southern charm was a man whose influence stretched well beyond the stage. He didn't just sing at church, he owned the choir, he booked the dates, controlled the money, managed the talent, and when someone stepped out of line, they found themselves not just silenced, but disappeared from gospel history altogether. How did a gospel singer become one of the most feared men in the music ministry? To answer that, we need to return to the early 1950s, when Sumner was already a rising star in gospel quartets like the Sunshine Boys and the Blackwood Brothers. He was tall, charismatic, and possessed a voice that defied nature. His tone didn't simply harmonize, it commanded. Within a decade, he would revolutionize gospel music's business model, touring structures, performance contracts, merchandise. But with that innovation came something else: control. In gospel's tight-knit community, loyalty was expected, and questions were unwelcome. Sumner wasn't just booking dates for himself. He was organizing entire festivals, managing group rosters, and brokering deals that determined who got stage time and who got sidelined. If you crossed him, your phone stopped ringing. If you obeyed him, you were protected, but never free. In 1965, Sumner founded J.D. Sumner and the Stamps Quartet, which would become a household name in Christian music circles. By 1969, they were opening for Elvis Presley, and that's when the stakes changed forever. Elvis was more than an icon. He was a business empire, and J.D. Sumner had found his crown jewel. The two men had a long history. Elvis, raised on gospel, idolized the genre, and especially loved Sumner's booming bass lines. They'd met when Elvis was still a teenager, hanging around gospel shows, offering to carry the Stamps equipment just for a chance to hear them rehearse. Decades later, Elvis would make J.D. part of his inner circle, on the payroll, on the plane, in the private moments. And Sumner made sure to keep it that way. He didn't just sing with Elvis, he watched him. And what he saw, he never forgot. Because in Elvis's unraveling, his addictions, his paranoia, his isolation, Sumner saw something else, an opportunity. And over the next 8 years, he would embed himself so deeply into Elvis's life and legacy that, when the king finally collapsed on his bathroom floor in 1977, Sumner was already positioning himself as the protector of his memory. But what exactly was he protecting? And what did he know that the world didn't? Because after Elvis died, J.D. Sumner didn't mourn like a friend. He moved like a man with secrets. Secrets worth guarding. Secrets worth burying. And, some whispered, secrets worth killing for. The relationship between Elvis Presley and J.D. Sumner was always presented as spiritual, innocent. Two Southern boys bonded by a love of gospel and God. But behind closed doors, their connection was darker, rooted not in faith, but in dependency. By 1971, Elvis was slipping, physically bloated, chemically medicated, and emotionally unstable. He was clinging to familiarity wherever he could find it. And gospel music, his first love, became his refuge. That's when Sumner pounced. Officially, the Stamps Quartet were just another backup group, but Elvis gave them unprecedented access. They didn't just perform at his shows, they lived inside his chaos. They traveled on his private jet, ate at his table, slept in his hotels. And Sumner, older and more grounded, became something of a caretaker, managing logistics, calming nerves, organizing rehearsals, and increasingly, controlling the gate. "He was more than a singer," said one of Elvis's former aides. "He was the filter. If you wanted to talk to Elvis, you went through J.D. And J.D. liked it that way." There are reports, quiet, unconfirmed but persistent, that Sumner controlled who got access to Elvis's backstage, that he intercepted letters, silenced critics, and kept watch on anyone Elvis grew close to. Some described it as loyalty, others as surveillance. Even inside Graceland, Sumner's presence loomed large. Visitors recalled him sitting in the corner during long, drug-addled nights, calm, expressionless, absorbing every word. He rarely intervened, but when he did, people listened. And then there was the money. In 1974, Elvis paid J.D. and the Stamps $1,000 a week, each. That was significantly more than standard rates for gospel quartets at the time. But when Presley's finances began to crumble under mismanagement and excess, Sumner's checks kept coming. Why? Some speculate he knew too much. Elvis's erratic behavior, his prescription dependencies, his affairs, all were witnessed by Sumner. And in the tight world of gospel, where appearances meant everything, Sumner knew how valuable discretion could be. After Elvis's death, Sumner publicly wept, sang at the funeral, released gospel albums dedicated to Elvis's memory. But behind the grief, there was a striking pattern. He consolidated control of the narrative. He gave interviews, told his version of events, even suggested that he alone had tried to save Elvis. Others disagreed. "It was always about him," said one unnamed gospel singer. "He saw Elvis as a brand, and he protected that brand like it was his own." And perhaps it was his own, because Sumner didn't just lose a friend in 1977, he lost his asset. And what he did next would ensure that no one could ever question how close he really was to the king, or what he may have done to keep it that way. After Elvis's death, the Stamps Quartet didn't fade. They rose. Their booking fees skyrocketed. Album sales surged, and J.D. Sumner, already a legend in gospel, became something more. A gatekeeper, a broker, a man whose name alone could make or break a career in Southern gospel. He formed business relationships with record labels, venue owners, even televangelists. And through those networks, he began to build a quiet empire, one powered by faith and sealed with fear. Because Sumner's real genius wasn't musical, it was contractual. He introduced new touring models for gospel acts, higher guarantees, exclusive bookings, and long-term performance contracts that locked groups into agreements most didn't fully understand. Young quartets, eager to make it, found themselves indebted, financially and personally, to Sumner's network. Some were forced to perform at discounted rates for years. Others lost control of their recording rights. A few were blacklisted entirely after pushing back. In one documented case from 1982, a Tennessee gospel group sued a booking agency closely tied to Sumner. They alleged that their appearances had been deliberately canceled after they refused to sign a multi-year exclusivity contract. The case was settled quietly, but rumors swirled that Sumner had intervened, off the record, to keep the group out of the major gospel circuits. Then there were the publishing rights. Sumner was known for encouraging songwriters to partner with him on new material, but those partnerships often came with caveats, co-ownership clauses that gave Sumner residuals for decades, even when his creative input was minimal. To the public, he was a pillar of Christian music, humble, reverent, trusted. But to insiders, he was something else entirely. a businessman in a preacher's suit. And the deeper you went into his network, the harder it was to leave. He controlled the stages, he controlled the airwaves, and increasingly, he controlled the narrative, especially the one surrounding Elvis. Because the closer you got to questioning that story, the story of friendship, loyalty, salvation, the more doors began to close. Calls went unanswered, tours were canceled, careers quietly died, and in their place, one truth remained. J.D. Sumner was no ordinary gospel singer. He was the architect of a kingdom, built not on grace, but on silence. By the early 1980s, J.D. Sumner had become gospel royalty, untouchable, unquestioned, and in complete control of his legacy. But in the smoky backrooms of Southern gospel venues and the whispered conversations of singers who had once worked alongside him, a new phrase began to emerge: the blackmail gospel. It wasn't a joke. It was the name given, half fearfully, half bitterly, to the power Sumner held over countless artists. Because by then, it was clear, J.D. wasn't just managing music. He was managing secrets. In a world built on image, clean-cut singers, God-fearing families, and wholesome Southern values, reputation was everything. And Sumner, with his decades in the business, knew all the cracks behind the stained glass. He knew who was drinking, who was cheating, who was struggling with demons their fans could never imagine. And more importantly, he knew how to keep that information tucked away or release it, if necessary. Over the years, he had developed what many insiders now refer to as a network of obedience, a subtle, calculated system of control where loyalty was rewarded and dissent was punished. If you played by his rules, you got access, stages, radio play, album distribution. If you didn't, you got silence. Or worse, there were stories, never confirmed but never quite denied either, about artists who had gone missing from the circuit without explanation. Not missing in the literal sense, but vanished from bookings, airwaves, and gospel press. One day, they were opening for legends. The next, they were playing to empty pews in rural churches, if they were playing at all. Most telling was the way people talked about Sumner in interviews. Carefully. No one criticized him directly. Even in retirement, even after he'd passed, gospel veterans would lower their voices when his name came up. There was a reverence there, yes, but beneath it, fear, as if saying too much might still cost them something, even from the grave. One insider, who spoke only under condition of anonymity, described an incident involving a gospel singer who had begun criticizing the Elvis estate's handling of royalties. That singer's next 3 tours were abruptly canceled. His distribution deal vanished. When he reached out to venues, he was told politely but firmly, "We've been advised to steer clear." The artist later told friends, "I should have never mentioned J.D." And then there were the tapes. It's long been rumored that Sumner kept recordings, phone calls, backstage conversations, even private confessions. Gospel singers, especially in the 1970s and 80s, often leaned on each other for support during hard times. Sumner, positioned as an elder and a mentor, was a frequent recipient of those confidences. Some believe he used them to maintain loyalty. Others believe he used them for protection. Because J.D. Sumner wasn't naive. He knew that as long as Elvis Presley's name echoed through history, people would eventually start asking questions about who was there, about what was seen, about what was allowed to happen. And Sumner had no intention of being caught unprepared, so he gathered leverage. And whether it was intentional or instinctual, that leverage allowed him to reign unchecked for over 3 decades. He wasn't just feared because of his connections. He was feared because he knew everyone else's sins, and no one knew his. The great irony of J.D. Sumner's life is that while he claimed to be a servant of the Lord, he spent his final decades tethered to a dead man. That man, of course, was Elvis Presley. From the moment Elvis died, Sumner went from background singer to primary narrator. He gave interviews, penned tributes, and even began touring with a revamped Stamps quartet, marketing their performances as living links to the King. He appeared on Christian television specials, not just singing gospel, but telling stories, intimate, first-hand recollections of Elvis's final years. Audiences were captivated. Here was a man who had walked beside a myth and lived to tell the tale. But those stories often served a dual purpose, sanctifying Elvis and sanitizing J.D. He painted their relationship as sacred, pure, bound by a shared love of gospel and God. He described late-night hotel room hymnals, tearful prayers, and spiritual conversations that, conveniently, no one else had been present to verify. And yet, cracks in the narrative began to appear. In a 1986 interview, when asked whether he had ever tried to intervene in Elvis's drug use, Sumner deflected. "That wasn't my place," he said. "I was there to sing." But other members of Elvis's entourage, especially those later known as the Memphis Mafia, remember it differently. "He was there all the time," said one member. "He saw everything. We were all scared, but J.D. was supposed to be the adult in the room." When pressed in later years about Elvis's mental and physical decline, Sumner always offered the same refrain. He needed Jesus. It was a convenient dodge, but not a convincing one, because J.D. wasn't just a witness, he was a gatekeeper. And when Elvis spiraled, when he locked himself in Graceland, medicated and paranoid, Sumner was one of the few still allowed inside. He knew about the pill bottles, the late-night rage, the overdoses, the bodyguards who were fired for raising concerns. He knew about the broken promises to go clean, the rehearsals missed, the friends pushed away. And yet, he stayed. Some saw that as loyalty. Others saw it as enabling. Because J.D. Sumner's status, his bookings, his income, even his legend, depended entirely on Elvis Presley. Without Elvis, Sumner was just another gospel singer. A good one, sure, but not unforgettable. But with Elvis, he became immortal by association, and he knew it, so he guarded that connection with religious fervor. He refused to let others speak ill of the king. He sued over unauthorized memoirs. He threatened to cut ties with anyone who questioned the official story. And he made sure that his version of Elvis, redeemed, misunderstood, holy, was the only one that survived. It wasn't just about love, it was about preservation. Because J.D. Sumner didn't just lose a friend in 1977, he lost his foundation, and he spent the rest of his life trying to rebuild it, one half-truth at a time. In 1998, just months after J.D. Sumner died, a young gospel historian began compiling a comprehensive retrospective on Southern gospel's evolution in the 20th century. His name was Russell Kane. Kane was ambitious, a meticulous researcher. He'd grown up idolizing the quartets of the 60s and 70s and wanted to preserve their stories. He interviewed dozens of artists, combed through archives, and began writing what he called the gospel machine. But as he dug deeper into J.D. Sumner's influence, he hit a wall. Every trail led to locked doors. Former singers clammed up. Booking agencies refused comment. Several publicists who had worked with Sumner refused to allow interview transcripts to be used. One church elder told Kane, "You're messing with something you don't understand." That would have been ominous enough. But then came the tapes. Kane acquired, from a now-deceased promoter, a series of cassette recordings marked S 1975-77. They were grainy, distorted, but unmistakable. Conversations between Sumner and other gospel executives discussing booking arrangements, finances, and, most damningly, Elvis. In one, Sumner is heard saying, "He ain't gonna make it through the year, but we're gonna ride this thing out. Milk it clean." Kane was stunned. He reached out to Sumner's family for comment. They denied the tape's authenticity, claimed they were doctored, threatened legal action. Then, mysteriously, Kane's publishing deal fell through. His emails stopped receiving replies. His sources ghosted him. His research funding dried up. The Gospel Machine was never published. Kane, disillusioned, left the gospel world behind. But the tapes remain, circulating quietly among collectors, Whispered about in the back rooms of gospel expos, no one dares play them publicly. No one wants to be the one who finally says it out loud. That J.D. Sumner may not have been a savior to gospel music, but its greatest manipulator. And maybe, just maybe, the biggest secret he ever kept wasn't about Elvis. It was about himself. By the late 1990s, whispers about J.D. Sumner's control had become a quiet thunder reverberating through Southern gospel circles. Still, most of those who dared to speak out found that the gatekeepers had already closed the door. Inside African American and white gospel communities alike, there were performers who'd shared hotel rooms, bus rides, and late-night prayers with Sumner. But after brief collaboration or honest critique, many found their careers evaporating. They'd go from opening slots in major revivals to playing sparsely attended church halls in rural towns, sometimes for free. Many attribute this to the so-called Sumner blacklist. Those who questioned the strictures, resisted booking terms, or even hinted at misconduct were quietly denied platforms. Contracts vanished, airplay stopped, venues that once welcomed them suddenly refused, and promoters tied to Sumner's network silently stopped even returning calls. A longtime tour manager for the Stamps recalls a single telling moment. An artist once visited the Stamps office to discuss a collaboration. The conversation was cordial, but when he balked at giving Sumner a portion of songwriting credit, he never booked another show in Tennessee again. Within weeks, he had faded from every major gospel festival, suggested he'd simply moved on. But friends in the business whispered another name, Sumner, and shook their heads. The result? Fear. Many insiders refused to be quoted in Kane's unpublished manuscript about gospel history. Others refused to return emails from journalists seeking historical accounts. Some who did speak up, or tried, became isolated. The result was self-censorship. Churches didn't want to risk losing Sumner's stamp of approval. Labels didn't want to pull licensing for fear of losing access to other acts. The power imbalance was clear. To challenge Sumner was to gamble with one's entire career. One elderly singer, who had once toured with the Stamps in the 1960s and had written gospel classics of her own, refused to appear in Kane's interviews. When pressed, she said simply, "He had that kind of reach." She never elaborated. She didn't need to. This chapter would culminate in another key incident. In 2002, a prominent gospel historian and archivist, Marion Duval, attempted to secure performance footage of the Stamps from the early 1970s to illustrate Sumner's influence in a college course. Over months, she was stonewalled. Her funding grants disappeared. Her department stopped responding to inquiries. She quietly resigned. That pattern, public denial, private paralysis, left a chasm. Few dared question the man whose bass voice had once seemed a gift of God. And so the testimonies that surfaced later, after Sumner's death, were often fragmented memories. They came out in whispers at reunions, in hesitant Facebook posts decades old, in private eulogies, all lacking a coherent narrative. But the missing pieces were telling. The fear was the story. In many ways, the silencing became the scandal. Because if you wanted to be remembered, you needed Sumner to say your name. But if you asked questions, he'd help you disappear. When J.D. Sumner died in 1998, most expected a reckoning. The man had been gone for decades, but his legend remained intact. Gospel radio paid tribute. Industry awards were bestowed posthumously. Even Graceland noted the passing of one of Elvis's long-serving companions. Yet late in 1998, another score was being settled, behind closed doors. Estate lawyers began combing through Sumner's will. A man who claimed to have no significant inheritance of his own suddenly sparked curiosity among publishers, royalty managers, and music rights experts. After all, he had performed at Elvis's funerals, had co-ownership deals with various songwriters, and had brokered contracts for decades. His legal heirs, which included distant relatives as well as long-standing gospel associates, were stunned to discover that Sumner's estate declared minimal assets. No royalties, no large investments, no stake in any publishing entities. Disbursements were predominantly to religious charities, a personal assistant, and the designated heirs of the Stamps Quartet members, not to songwriting partners. Whispers of misappropriated funds began to surface. Those who had co-owned songs claimed they never saw residuals post-1985. Others, involved in booking negotiations, alleged that contract commissions were never paid out as promised. Some contracts even disappeared entirely. One young gospel songwriter, who had inked a co-publishing agreement in 1984, eventually took his claim to court. He won a settlement in 2001, but after legal fees, saw little more than a fraction of what was owed. He later told friends, "It was always about control. He took the voice and the money. I never saw either." Meanwhile, Sumner's extensive recording backlog, the material he claimed ownership of, was sold off in bulk to an independent label that specialized in obscure gospel releases. No royalty audits were ever made public. No surviving family members reported financial windfall, just stacks of low-cost CDs in bargain bins. This disappearance of wealth mirrored another theme, the disappearance of truth. Just as careers vanished, so did financial accountability. Those who survived Sumner's reign often emerged with artistic legacies, but no financial vindication. Decades later, when some of those old colleagues attempted to reconcile unpaid royalties, they were told all contracts had been fulfilled. But public auditors found discrepancies. Many critics now believe that Sumner intentionally structured his estate to transfer value into untraceable channels: church donations, offshore trusts, shell companies tied to title-holding ministries. By leveraging legal complexity, confidentiality clauses, and undisclosed bookkeepers, he ensured that what existed during his life vanished at his death. The inheritance that remained was a myth, and the artists who actually carried his music were left empty-handed. It's rarely reported, but in 2003, during a small conference for independent gospel artists in Memphis, a former songwriter named Carol Rhodes stood up to speak. She had once co-written a hymn with members of the Stamps in the late 1970s, paid modestly at the time, promised residual proceeds for years, but never received a dime post-1985. Summoned to the conference as a vocal advocate for song rights, she used the mic not for gospel, but for accountability. In a reverent but hushed voice, she said, "I devoted years to that group. I wrote songs from prayer and grief and hope. And now I can't even find the royalties. Not a check. Not a statement." A hush fell. Then, to everyone's shock, another man, an elderly former road manager for Sumner, stepped forward. "He had us singing about grace," the man added, then took it for himself. It was one of the few times Sumner-era affiliates spoke candidly. Not with anger, but with moral frustration. Their stories, fragmented, brief, crept into gospel forums, local church newsletters, and eventually, digital archives concerned with historical injustice in Christian music. And those conversations fueled the final chapter of the exposé, that the real sin wasn't drunkenness or manipulation. It was the theft of spiritual labor. Rhodes's public admission sparked a flood of confirmation. Others shared contracts, bank statements, canceled checks, correspondence, proof of ongoing neglect. Over the following years, nonprofit legal funds formed to assist aggrieved artists. Lawsuits were filed, settled quietly, awarded minimally. Many survivors said they didn't want money. They wanted acknowledgement. They wanted the truth on record. Acknowledgement of what belief and labor they had poured in, and what had been taken. Sumner himself was never publicly tied to these disputes. He had long passed. But the silence around his death, no contrition, no investigation, remained. When asked why no confessions happened earlier, Rhodes simply replied, "Fear works. Reputation lasts beyond the grave." And that truth had allowed Sumner to avoid scrutiny and to remain sacred in public memory. It began with a voice so low it rumbled beneath the surface of gospel music like a coming storm. J.D. Sumner's bass was an earthquake in a choir robe, a divine anomaly that didn't just sing about God. It seemed to speak for him. And that's what made him untouchable. Even now, decades after his death, his legacy clings to the walls of Southern gospel like smoke in an old church. Portraits of him hang in music museums. His name is still intoned at industry banquets like scripture. The man who stood behind Elvis, who built the Stamps Quartet into a global institution, remains revered in public. But beneath the stained glass narrative, the floorboards are beginning to creak. Because the truth didn't die with him, it just waited. In quiet corners of the industry, among overlooked arrangers, forgotten vocalists, and former friends who now speak only in conditional tenses, a different portrait has emerged. Not of a monster, not even of a villain, but of a man who understood one thing better than music: control. J.D. Sumner built more than a quartet. He built a kingdom, one where access to stages, studios, and even radio airplay ran through his hands. And the price of that access? Loyalty, silence, deference.